story from Columbia's past. Just a reminder as we go through this evening, if you feel a need for some reflection or someone you'd like to talk to, there is space downstairs here in this building if you need to step out, and so that is available. At this time, we'd like to welcome Carol Penner, who Brian mentioned already, who is our speaker this evening. Carol, why don't you come on up and I'll introduce you. Carol is currently on faculty at Conrad Grebel University College, teaching in the area of practical theology. She's been a pastor in the Mennonite Church, Canada, and Mennonite Brethren churches in Ontario and Alberta. She lives in Vineland, Ontario with her husband Eugene in a house surrounded by apricot trees. Carol is going to be presenting on abuse in the church, sin, accountability, and forgiveness. Welcome, Carol.
Good evening, everyone. I have a little handout about my talk, and I'm going to have Brian hand that out. So I know some of you like to take notes. You don't have to. It's all there, everything I'm going to say. So if you have to step out, don't worry. You can take the paper with you. I've been thinking about this topic for a long time. I started working with Mennonite Central Committee probably 20 years ago, doing advocacy about sexual violence, family violence. And so as part of that, I started to meet women who'd been abused by their pastors. And for me to be here tonight, to see the church talking openly about this problem, it is revelatory for me that times have changed, because for a long time the church didn't want to talk about this at all, and the problem has been there the whole time. So thank you so much, Brian, for inviting me, and for the board for having the courage to do this conference. It means a lot to me personally. I wish I was here talking about something really happy like love and peace and things like that, but I'm here to talk about abuse, which is a hard topic and it's heavy. And maybe you feel that heaviness in your body, like, oh, this is heavy. But you know what? This heavy topic is related to love and peace, because you can't have love and peace unless you're going to look at some of the hard things in this world that work against love and peace. And so we're here to talk about abuse because we love people. We love victims who have been hurt by people. We love the people who hurt people. We love the church that's hurt when people get hurt. And we love the world, and we want to be a witness to the world. We want to spread the gospel, and we cannot do that if our house is not in order. So we need to look at this if we want to be faithful. So when Brian asked me, what do you want to talk about? He left it open. What do you want to talk about with this topic? It's huge. I decided I wanted to talk about three things with our theology that we sometimes get wrong around the area of pastoral abuse. That is sin, accountability, and forgiveness. And I think it's so appropriate. Brian talked about each one of those things today already. And so you're going to hear resonances between what he said and what I'm going to talk about today. I can't say everything, but I can say a few points, and hopefully it will get some discussion going, and I'll leave time for questions. So what kind of a sin is pastoral abuse? Like Brian said, it's a sin of power. It's a sin of abuse of power. Because the church needs leaders. God calls leaders for the church, and as a church, we don't know who those people are, so we have to pray about it. We have to discern who are our leaders. We have to call our leaders. And once we get them, we love them. And we empower them, and we listen to them. And we do what they say, mostly. I've been a pastor. You don't always listen to us. But pastors have power because the church believes that God has given us leaders. And so when a leader takes that power that God and the community has given them, and instead of helping people and growing the church and spreading God's love, if instead they use that power for themselves, to get something for themselves, no matter what the cost is to anyone else, that's abuse. They're abusing the power that God gave them. And that's the kind of sin it is. When I think about examples of this, the one that comes to mind the first is probably the most infamous person who committed misconduct, pastoral misconduct, which was John Howard Yoder, who was a pastor and a professor at a Mennonite seminary in the United States, who was probably the most well-known theologian Mennonites have ever had. And he met with students and told them that he could have sexual contact with them because it was a new ethic. It was a new revelation God had given him that they could allow this to happen. And because he was so revered and looked up to, women believed him. And he was able to use his power, which was given to him by the seminary, by the church, by God, because God gave him such a good mind. He used that power to get what he wanted, no matter what the cost was to the women he abused. So he coerced people by convincing them to do something, but he also sexually assaulted them with physical force as well, that too. As Brian said, sometimes it's coercion through convincing someone that you're in a mutual relationship, that I love you, you love me, I need you, I can't do my work without you. And that sort of power that I'm your pastor, and for you to follow me means you must do what I tell you sexually. It's just a huge abuse of power. So, when I explain it like that, when Brian explains it, it seems so clear, I hope it seems clear. Yes, that's wrong. Why has the church had such a hard time figuring that out? Why? Well, I think it's because sin is tricky. That's the nature of it. Sin is very tricky. We don't always recognize sin, or we concentrate on certain sins, and other sins we just are oblivious to. In our own lives, that's true. I know it's true in my life. And we need people to help point that out to us. But in the church, this trickiness means that we sometimes don't see pastoral abuse because of us concentrating on other things. So one of the reasons why we have a hard time seeing pastoral abuse as abuse of power is because as a church, we've really concentrated on sexual sins over many other types of sins. I see that through an example, through my own church congregation growing up. The only time I ever saw someone stand up and confess something was when she got pregnant. No one else ever confessed anything in front of the church. And why is that? Why didn't someone stand up and say, I bought a cottage and an expensive car this year, I didn't give money to the poor, and I confess, I'm sorry. Or why did someone say, I'm very self-centered, I talk only about myself, I'm so full of pride, I am sorry. Jesus pointed out pride and money just as much or more than sex. Why as a church do we concentrate on sexual sins? I think that warpedness we have in our mind about sin and sex, that means when we hear about pastoral abuse, when we hear about a sexual sin that our pastor has committed, we immediately flip into that mode of sexual sin. That's wrong. It's mutual. It's two people have sinned. And we don't see it as abuse of power. We see it as a sexual morality issue. And so that's why when John Howard Yoder abused a woman, one of them went right away to the seminary president and said to him, this is what this professor did to me. And she was told that she was an adulterer and that she should be expelled from the seminary. And it sounds so horrible, but that happens all the time. All the time. When women come forward with their story, they're told that they're to blame because of this whole sexual sin thing. Another reason why it's tricky and hard to identify pastoral abuse is because we respect our leaders so much. We love our leaders. And it's very hard for us to get our head around the fact that people who we love and respect so much could be so bad. It's just really hard. And so we'd rather not go there, and so we just disbelieve victims. And I know how hard that is because I've had that experience in my own life. When I was not as a victim, but as hearing about a story like that, my story that for me was when I was working as a chaplain in a hospital. The head of our department was a Catholic priest who I really respected, and everyone loved him. He was respected everywhere. He was a fabulous pastoral counselor. He was an excellent speaker. He was a skilled administrator, And right around the time that I was working in the hospital with him, I was getting ordained in my Mennonite congregation. And because this priest was such an influence in my life, I talked to my pastor and we invited him to speak at my ordination. And 1 week before my ordination, it came out that he had abused 2 children. And it was mind-boggling for me. I just could not get my head around it. And a really big thing was that I couldn't believe that I didn't know. I couldn't believe that I was such a bad judge of character. I asked him to speak at my ordination. I thought I was a good judge of character, and I obviously was totally misled. And people don't like to be misled. And so instead of believing that we can be misled, we believe the pastor and we think that the victim is making it up. And so that's why pastoral abuse is tricky to identify, is that we don't want to admit that we could be wrong about people. It's very hard for us. And the third thing is, another thing that Brian mentioned, is that people who abuse are very good at lying, very good at it. They're very good at covering their tracks. And so often you don't have very much evidence to prove anything. It's he said, she said. And because the person has power and they're a leader, we believe the leader. And often I've seen that the person who's abusing chooses people that might not be believed. Maybe they had a crisis in their life. Maybe they're under a lot of stress. Maybe they've had mental health issues. Maybe they're on the edge of the community. Maybe they're a person of color. Maybe they're a newcomer to the community, someone that you're not really going to believe. And so if they come forward with their story isn't listened to. Now, even when we have proof that someone has abused someone, what do we do? What do we do with this sin of pastoral abuse? We don't do the right thing usually. And I think part of that problem is that as Mennonites, we don't take sin seriously enough, which is a really funny thing to say, because Mennonites have been so crazy about sin and casting people out of the church over sin. So how can I say that Mennonites haven't taken sin seriously enough? Well, that's the thing about, we are very selective about what sin is. Some sins we're like crazy about, and some sins we just don't want to look at, and so we don't take it seriously enough. We don't think that people can be that bad. I think that Mennonites have this just basic understanding that people are good, and that we're all trying to be good people here, and we accept people at face value when they say something. Could they really be that bad? It's very hard for us. And the verse that's been very instructive for me over time has been Jesus telling the disciples when they go out into the world to minister to be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves, is that they need to be innocent and love people, but they also have to be wise to the way of the world and wise to the ways of sin, and not to have the wool pulled over their eyes. When we have sin revealed to us, when we finally accept that something bad happened with our pastor, we cannot be naive. We cannot be naive and think that we can trust that person when they tell us that it was one person, one time. We just can't believe them. We need to have our eyes open to the reality of pastoral abuse, because most people who cross boundaries cross multiple boundaries with multiple people. So we need to have our mind open to the reality of pastoral abuse, that sin happens in church, and we can't always tell where. And if you think that abuse can't happen in the church, it's going to happen there, because that's a safe place to be a sinner and to do bad things, because no one's suspecting you. So that's sin, looking at it from the person who commits the pastoral abuse, but that's not the only part of sin. When we're talking about this topic, Brian also mentioned this, that sin happens when the institution and the church and people in the church will not believe the victim. That is a sin. It's a sin to blame the victim. It's a sin to let the person stay in power and abuse more people. And it's a sin to ostracize someone who's come forward with a story, and it's a sin to force her out of the church. And I've seen all those things happen. I see it happen all the time. When someone comes forward with a complaint against a church, they usually leave the church because they cannot stay because people look at them and don't trust them. People hate them. It's so sad. And so when someone comes to me and says, I'm thinking of laying a complaint against my church leader, I am honest with them. I say, are you ready to give up your church? Because if you talk about this, it's going to be hard for you to stay there. I hope you can stay. I hope they will treat you well. But honestly, most of the time, it's going to be hard for you to stay. The Bible story that helps me the most when I'm thinking about this is the story of the man who fell among thieves. Jesus tells that story, and he's left beaten and broken on the side of the road. And Jesus doesn't tell the story to tell you about the thieves. He tells the story to tell you about the priest and the Levite who walk right by. And for victims of pastoral abuse, yes, the abuser is a problem, but a really big problem is the church walking right by. And I've talked to victims who say that I was abused by one bad person, but when I went to get help from my church, they told me I was a liar and that I was making things up, and I had to leave the church. And that deeper betrayal is when the community doesn't listen to you and treats you badly. And so the sin of the church is to not take the abuse seriously. So that is sort of a little section on sin. So what do we do with sin? How do we hold people accountable for it? Jesus held people accountable, especially religious leaders. He said that the truth will set us free. Mennonites haven't always dealt with accountability. We like the word forgiveness a lot better. Let's just jump to forgiveness because maybe the problem will go away if we forgive it. We don't like accountability. But we need to talk about pain, and we need to talk about what are the consequences of this person's actions. And on my little paper there, you'll see a list of the things that happen for victims. And that's a very short list, and it doesn't say everything. But survivors of abuse no longer trust church leaders. Imagine if you went through the rest of your life not trusting a thing a pastor told you. They feel unsafe in the Christian community. Think how when you're hurting, you go to your church and you feel comforted. That's gone. That's gone for that person, for a long time at least. They often leave the church because of abuse. They can have difficulty with their spirituality because someone in God's name abused them. And they can have problems with self-esteem and with intimacy, and they can and do contemplate suicide as a way of dealing with the pain. That's the pain of the one victim. But then there's the pain of the family members around them and their friends. That's a whole nother list of things. And then there's the list of things that I didn't have room in my one-page summary here of the church. How does the church suffer when pastoral abuse happens? And there are big consequences. When a church finds out that their pastor has abused someone, they feel like this has never happened before in the history of the world. They think they are the first church dealing with this, but they are not. There is a lot of work that's been done on this. There are studies done, research. You can find, if you want to, best practices of what you should do. And the best practices in the research tell us that if your pastor is found to have committed sexual misconduct with a congregant, within 3 years, you will lose 1/3 of your church. 1/3 of your church will walk out the door. That's an average. So some churches will lose more, and some might lose a little bit less. That's the consequence. Imagine if your church lost 1/3 of its members in 3 years. From that, a good percentage of churches will close because of that. And I've seen 2 congregations I've been involved with pastoral abuse close within 5 years of a misconduct. And these were vibrant churches spreading the gospel, doing good work in their community, loving each other, really a place where God was active. And 5 years later, their doors are closed. This morning, we had a little prayer meeting about this conference, and people were sharing scripture passages that God had laid on their hearts, and one of the scripture passages was about the powers and principalities of the world. And I truly believe that when we are doing great things in the church, that's where we are attacked to try and destroy that ministry. And one of the ways to destroy it is to attack one person, the leader, a leader, and have them do something bad. And it is shocking to think that one person's actions that might not even take that long, a couple of minutes, can destroy a ministry that's lasted 100 years. How does it happen? But it does happen. And so accountability is saying that one person's actions can have this huge, dramatic impact on the church. And so what do we do about that? What do we do about it in the church? Number one thing, I think, is to report the abuse to the police. I think that is something churches don't want to do. That's the last thing they want to do, is call the police. And I think it should be the first thing they think about it. Because if you're walking down the street and someone touches you sexually that you didn't ask for it, you don't know them, and they just did that, you're going to say, that's sexual assault, call the police. If your pastor does it, that is also sexual assault. You should call the police. Of course, there's scripture passages that make you pause, that have caused people to pause. 1 Corinthians 6 says, don't take your disputes to the secular authorities, try and solve it yourself. Or Matthew 18, if your brother sins against you, go to them. And if they don't listen, take another person. We know these passages. We've heard them our whole lives. But I see those passages applied very selectively. And when I think about people who have committed other crimes in the church, they aren't applied. So when the church treasurer takes $100,000 from your building fund, I don't hear anyone talking about Matthew 18. They say, he's a crook. Call the police. He needs to get arrested. You don't say, well, he said he's sorry. We'll just let him be the treasurer for the next year as well. No one ever does that. They say, no, he has committed a crime, we're calling the police. But the main reason why you have to turn this over to the police is that the church is not equipped to do investigations that are criminal. We are not equipped, and we will totally mess it up. And I see that time and time again. Because first of all, we are not equipped to think so badly of our leaders, and they will pull the wool right over our eyes. They will say things and we'll believe them when we shouldn't. And the police are more suspicious. They've seen people like this. They know liars. They will see patterns. They will be careful to not trust this person. And so they need to do the investigation. But also, we are not sensitive enough to the needs of victims when we do investigations. And I don't blame the church, because we are not equipped for that. We are volunteers. You sit on the committee, the church board committee, you're a volunteer. Suddenly you have a pastoral abuse issue. Someone's got to do it. Who's going to look into it? Oh, well, I guess those 3 people will. And you have to sit down and do something. You aren't equipped and you have no idea how to do it, and you're going to do it wrong. And I've heard victims tell me how wrong it's gone, where one victim I know was asked to tell the story 5 different times to the church in different committees to different groups of men. Can you imagine if you were sexually assaulted, you having to tell your story again and again to groups of men? And the questions they would ask you, like, well, do you think it was wise to let him into the house at that time of night? What were you wearing? That question. Those sorts of things that you ask victims that make them feel guilty about what happened. Why didn't you just walk away? Why didn't you tell people? Things that make them feel like it's their fault, if only they had done something different. And so that's why it's best to turn it over to the police and have an investigation done criminally. But while I say that, and I do believe that that's the right thing to do, I am not a great believer that the justice system will bring justice. It's not going to bring justice. It rarely brings justice with sexual assault. With police cases, you just look at the statistics of all the people who report. You can look at Statistics Canada. If you report a sexual assault to the police, they only press charges in half the accounts that they get. Because if it's just he said, she said, they don't think it's a good case and they won't pursue it. And even if it's pursued, only 5% of cases result in a criminal conviction with a jail time, 5%, which is a lot lower than other types of crimes. And part of the problem with pastoral abuse is that you don't report it right away, because most people can't figure out that it was abuse right away. It takes years to get in a different place, in a healthier place, where you realize, hey, I went to my pastor because I was having a marriage breakdown and he made sexual advances to me. He shouldn't have done that in the counseling setting. That's wrong. But you don't realize that at the time because you're very upset. But 5 years later you do, and then you report it. But assault convictions are not likely to be prosecuted after a number of years have passed. The place where I've seen pastoral abuse, misconduct successfully prosecuted usually has to do where there is physical evidence of emails or pictures, or if a pastor puts a camera in a washroom to take pictures of women and the camera gets found. Then they get convicted because there's some hard evidence there. So it's very difficult for justice to happen in the justice system. So then what do we do? Where does accountability come from? What do we do in the church? I think, we're turning the page, flip it over. Accountability in the Christian community. Do we hold our leaders accountable? And I think this is more about prevention, this section. It has to do with being transparent about what happens in church. If you go to your doctor, and we all become very vulnerable with our doctors, we take our clothes off in front of our doctors. And if they touch us in a sexual way, we can go to the College of Physicians and Surgeons. You open up their website, right on the front page, there's a link. It says there, press here, lay a complaint, file a misconduct report. It's right there. They know what happens, and they have a place for you to complain. Churches don't like to do that. I don't know any churches, very few churches, there's a couple I found, but very few will put that on their website. I was doing some work for a Christian camp, helping them write a resource for counselors to teach them about not breaking boundaries with the counselors that are like in training and campers. And I asked them, do you have your misconduct policy on your website? Do you have a place where people can lay a complaint online? No, we don't. I said, that's the first place to start. And I think church camps, church schools, church institutions haven't wanted to do that because they say, well, it looks like we think abuse is going to happen here. Well, yes, that's right. That's right. We aren't different than anywhere else. It happens here, and it's going to be transparent if it happens. This whole idea of transparency, I really like that, Brian. And having that on your website is part of transparency. And I think about people sending their kids to camp. If you look on the camp website and it says file a complaint, that's a good sign. That's a good sign. They take it seriously. They're not going to sweep anything under the rug. So that's the way the world is today, and the church needs to catch up with that. A really big problem with accountability in the church is that we quickly jump to forgiveness, and I'll be talking about that in a minute. We want to give people another chance. We always want to think the best of people and give them another chance. When someone is caught, they sound sorry. They sound very sorry. And we believe them. And this choice then to let them go means that, why do we let them go? We let them go because they cry, usually. They cry in a meeting, and they say they're sorry. And they say, if you do this, if you let people know about this, my life will be ruined. You're going to embarrass my family, and this will bring shame on the church. So don't do this. Don't please. And they beg you not to tell anyone. And so what do? In the cases I've seen so often, they don't tell anyone. They just let them go. They say, okay, you can't work here anymore, but you resign, and we won't do anything. We won't say anything publicly as long as you go. And we're not going to give you a reference, so don't don't ask us for a reference. You shouldn't work in this field anymore. And we think that's the answer. We think that's safe. But that's not good accountability because, number one, you haven't let people in the church know, and so other victims haven't been able to come forward. So you're letting this person go, but maybe there are 10 other women suffering in the church who've been abused by him. They don't get a chance to say this happened to me because you just let them slide out the door. And that's a big problem. And also, you're letting him loose on the world to go do it again because you're not publicizing this, and no one will ever find out that it happened. Except for the little red mark in his file in the conference office that this happened. He'll go to a different province and a different church denomination, and he will apply for a job and he will get it. And you say, well, he won't get a reference though. But you know what? If someone is able to lie enough to abuse people, they can lie about a resume. Lying about a resume is the least of their things that they have to do. And they'll just say, well, I was in Europe traveling for 2 years. Why is there nothing there? Well, they won't tell about your church. They won't call about your church. There's just no easy way that they will find a way to get another job, and they will want to have another job, and they'll do that. So it's really important to do accountability. And because the church has not been good at that, because we tend to put little red marks in files instead of making public declarations about things, advocates for survivors of abuse have taken things into their own hands, and thank God for the internet, because they've put things online so that you can find out things about people who've been accused and found guilty of pastoral abuse in the Mennonite Church. There's a Mennonite abuse prevention website where you'll find a list of 29 men and 1 woman who have been found guilty either through the courts or through a church process. And all the documentation is online for you to see what they did and how it was investigated. That's so if your pastor from Saskatchewan that you let go because he abused someone, if he goes to Arkansas to work in the Baptist church, they can Google his name and they'll find that story. So I think that's a really important thing about accountability. And it's all about protecting the most vulnerable among us. Too often, I think, we are busy protecting powerful people, protecting the livelihood of powerful people who abuse people, rather than protecting vulnerable people. And that's about accountability. Who is the church accountable to? My final section, forgiveness. This is such an important thing in the world because Jesus died for our sins and Jesus forgives us. And I thank God for that. Jesus can forgive the worst thing we can do. And Jesus forgives pastoral abuse when we are repentant of that. We talk a lot about forgiveness in the Mennonite world. But forgiveness and accountability go hand in hand, and that's why I did accountability first, because you need to put those two things together, because accountability and repentance are very closely connected. If you love someone, and if you love your pastoral leader, you will never put them in temptation's way again if they've abused someone. I think about Jesus. He called all sorts of sinners to be his disciples. He called Matthew, the tax collector, to be his disciple. Matthew was the money man. He was like the banker. He would have been the person most familiar with money. He spent his life counting money. But who did Jesus give the purse to in the disciples? He didn't give it to Matthew, the money man. He gave it to Judas. And how humiliating that must have been for Matthew to be the money guy and have Jesus hand the purse to someone who didn't know as much about money. But Jesus knew that Matthew was tempted by money. I'm not going to give the money to him. Not that Jesus didn't love Matthew. Matthew was loved by Jesus. Matthew wrote a gospel. It's also interesting if you read the Gospel of Matthew, and I invite you to do that, go and see what he has to say about Judas stealing the money. He has mercy on Judas. He has mercy on him. He says that Jesus called him friend. Whereas the Gospel of John says that he says terrible things about Judas. But Matthew had mercy on Judas. I think they had a connection because of that money thing. Anyway, I could preach a sermon on that. I have preached a sermon on that. Forgiveness and accountability, they go hand in hand. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting. So, the third point, and this is one of my most important things, and this is, the church gets this wrong so much. Who does the forgiving? Who does the forgiving? Of course, God does the forgiving. I didn't write that down because that's of course. God forgives us. God forgives us. When you repent, when you've sinned, you ask God for forgiveness, and God, when God sees you're repenting, God will forgive you. But who among us forgives people? The person who is hurt is the person who gives forgiveness, not anyone else. I was at a Mennonite Central Committee meeting probably 10 years ago, and it was a workshop setting, and they had a man speaking from El Salvador. He had been in the military police in El Salvador, and he had tortured people. And in this workshop, he shared a little bit about that story, about his eventual conversion to Christianity and his move to Canada, and how now he felt so bad about what he had done as a torturer, torturing people for years. Tells the story. The story, everyone's quiet in the workshop. Oh, heavy, heavy. And then out of this quietness, a man stands up and says, "Brother, I speak on behalf of everyone here. We forgive you. We forgive you for what you've done." You know, I left that meeting holding my head, thinking, who are we to forgive him? He didn't hurt us. He did not hurt us. We can say, "Brother, forgiveness is possible from God, and we encourage you to go to the people you've hurt and make it right with them." But we cannot give him forgiveness. We cannot do that because we are not the hurt ones. And in the issue of pastoral abuse, so often the people who are not hurt feel they have the power to give forgiveness, but they are not the hurt ones. It's the victims who get to forgive. And it's their journey. It's not our journey. We might be bystanders, we might be secondary victims, but we are not the people who have the power to forgive. So the caution around that is that the person who is offended wants to be forgiven because they feel so bad. And they go to the wrong people to get forgiveness. They go to everyone else to get forgiveness, but they don't go to the right people. And if the wrong people give them forgiveness, it bypasses accountability entirely. And so I just wanted to highlight that it's really important to go to the right place to ask for forgiveness. And forgiving pastoral abuse quickly is a big problem because, again, it bypasses accountability. There's a book on the back table that I really encourage you to get. It's hopefully in the library here, called Sexual Offending and Restoration by Mark Yancey. It's an older book, but it's been republished. And Mark worked with people who'd offended, men who offended. He ran groups for them for 20 years. And he writes about what does it mean to abuse someone. And he says, when you sexually abuse someone, you've objectified them. You have no empathy for them. That is what allows you to abuse them, because you don't even think about the world from their perspective. And so for you to repent of doing that, you have to get empathy. And he said he never saw anybody get empathy in less than a year of counseling. Never. It takes a year of counseling to try to build some empathy for someone else that you hurt. A year of counseling. And so what happens when the person who's caught sexually abusing someone goes to a meeting 2 weeks later and cries and says, "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." And if people forgive him, the church board forgives him, what is that about? First of all, it's not theirs to forgive. Secondly, he is not repentant yet. He is not repentant. He hasn't at all understood what he did. He's sorry he got caught. That's why he's crying. He will cry and cry. He feels terribly sorry, but not for the person he hurt. So don't forgive quickly. Forgive in the long term. That it's a long process. And don't pressure victims to forgive. That's my final point about forgiveness. And that is really important, because forgiveness is a journey, and it's not something that happens just because you have to. it may come with the grace of God. But I think the person who, for me, has been the most profound theologian on this topic in the Mennonite Church is Wilma Dirksen. Some of you know her. She wrote a book about the disappearance and murder of her daughter in Winnipeg. And she talks about how forgiving someone who's violated you so badly is a lifelong journey. It's not a one-time thing. You do it every day when you miss your daughter. You got to forgive him again. It's a journey your whole life. And so 70 times 7 becomes 700 times 70 every single day. It's a journey. And to tell a victim that they must forgive now is wrong. It's a sin to tell a victim that. And also, what they need is support and help and love, is that we hope that's the direction you'll go. We'll pray for you. We'll walk with you. By God's grace, you'll get there. But if you don't get there, we still love you. We still love you because you've been violated. The problem with this is that usually the person who has offended is very manipulative, and they will take that forgiveness thing and use it as a hammer, and they will use it as a weapon to change the church to be on their side. Because 3 weeks after it's revealed, he'll tell the church board, I asked for forgiveness, and she would not forgive me. It's such a burden I'm carrying. Poor me, I can't be forgiven by her. She's holding on to her anger. Do something about it. And suddenly it's the person who offended who's the victim. Poor him. They're holding him hostage because they won't forgive him. I mean, that sounds crazy, but it happens. I just see it over and over again, that they demand forgiveness. And, it may be that the person who offended is going to live the rest of their life unforgiven by the people they hurt. That's the burden they have to carry, the consequence of their actions. They cannot require it. They will be forgiven by God when they are repentant. And that's the important forgiveness. But on earth, we're broken people, and forgiveness comes in its own time by God's grace. So I've chosen 3 things to talk about today. I've given different points about it. I hope that what you can take from this is that abuse needs to be something we really think about, and our theology needs to address it and be careful not to fall into the traps we've fallen into before, and we don't need to. We can look and see what are the best practices, because the people we love are survivors of abuse. The people we love are people who've committed abuse, and we love the church, and God loves us all. And so let's do it right. So, now I guess we can have some questions.
Thank you, Carol. Let's flip to the next slide. This is the moment where you get permission to have your phone out and no one will judge you. And we're going to have some Q&A via text message, and partly that's for the reason of recognizing the sensitive nature of this topic, and the thought of speaking in front of a large group of people may be the barrier of asking a question that's really important, and we want to give you opportunity to ask. And so Afton over here has the phone with that number, and so you can text your question to her, and she will read your question to Carol. I'm going to begin us with a question just to allow space for those questions to come in. So my question is, you talked about sin early on, and the challenge of addressing institutional sin or systemic sin, especially with the phrase I hear often and have found, even I think Brian mentioned a bit, not my problem.
Oh, yeah, not my problem.
What do I have to do with that person, that leader's sin? And there's barriers to owning or taking responsibility for systemic or institutional sin. Mm-hmm. Do you have some tips or ways to help those of us who feel like it's not our problem,
right,
or when we're engaging people who have that response, ways to help us realize it is our problem and how to
right,
take responsibility?
Right. Well, I think a lot of it has to do with what Brian talked about in his thing, is listening to the survivors of abuse, because it doesn't matter how long ago it happened. If it wasn't resolved, it's still fresh. It may have happened 35 years ago, but if they never got a response from the church that was appropriate, it's fresh in their mind. It hasn't healed. It's a festering wound. And so if you have empathy for victims of abuse, you will see it as your problem. And too often people feel that, well, let sleeping dogs lie. No one's talked about this. It's that one troublemaker. We don't need to deal with that. But it's never one troublemaker. There's always more people. And it's a courageous person who's coming forward. And when you deal with that problem, you will usually find more survivors of abuse.
So the first question is pretty straightforward. What was the title of the Wilma Dirksen book?
Oh, yeah. Have you seen Candace? And she's written another book, or another 2 books. She's a real prolific author. Just Google her name, Wilma Dirksen. She's very active with victims' rights, and she tackles the subject of forgiveness really intensely. In fact, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book and featured Wilma Dirksen in one of his chapters because she has such a remarkable story with forgiveness.
Okay. The next question is, are there positive examples of churches which have dealt well with pastoral abuse?
Yes, there are positive stories, and that's happening more frequently. And I'm really happy about that because conferences like this raise awareness about it. And I think we're teaching people more about what abuse is. And when people know what abuse is, they can come forward with their stories sooner, and it can be dealt with better. And so I think churches are starting to realize there are really good resources there that they can access, and they're realizing that they should not do the investigation. The police should do the investigation, or else get in a team, an outside team, to do that. In Ontario Mennonite Church, Eastern Canada, David's going to be talking about this, I'm sure. At some point, you can ask him about it. They have it set up that if a pastoral abuse allegation comes forward, an outside team comes in to investigate automatically. The church has the resources. So it's not the church board chair who's related to the person who's victimizing someone.
The next question is, how would you best assess genuine and disingenuous repentance?
Right. Well, I don't know, because we can't judge the heart. I mean, as I said, you look on the outside of someone and they're so great. Our pastors are wonderful people. They do great things. And it's very hard to tell what's inside their heart. But I would say that pastoral abuse takes time to be repentant. It takes a year of counseling. So they may be repentant now, and that's good, but they'll really be repentant after a year of counseling. That's better. I think that you can't think that they've reached the end of their journey in 2 weeks when they've been abusing a number of people. So, one thing I wanted to say is an example of how people have a hard time believing their pastor could do something bad because he was such a good pastor. He was with me in the hospital when my mother died. He really helped me get through this. He prayed with me in this situation. And the thing is, I always say, well, murderers don't murder everyone. They just murder one person, or hopefully one. But if you don't have to be bad to everyone to be a bad person. You're bad to a couple people, and that's enough to make you a murderer. The same with pastoral abuse. You can be a fabulous pastor to everyone, but you're crossing boundaries with a couple of people. And in fact, the good that you're doing covers up the bad that you're doing. And it's like you have to become super pastor because you don't want anyone to suspect the bad things. Anyway.
The next question is, how should churches deal with the family members of abusers?
Oh boy, that is so hard. That is so hard. I would say that is one of the number one challenges for church conferences to deal with, and churches, because you don't want to hurt them, but it is natural for the family members of an abuser to support the abuser and say they didn't do it, and to vociferously defend them and say, you're being unfair, you're hurting them, you're hurting us, don't do this, don't do this. But for the church to hold the offender accountable, they are not hurting the family. The offender is hurting the family because they have to have the consequences of what they've done brought public. And so too often I've seen churches listen to the wife of the abuser and say, begging you, don't make this public. It will hurt our family. What will my children say? And they listen to that because they take that as a bigger priority than the priority of the victim's justice and finding other victims. It's excruciating, but you are not causing that pain. The offender's causing the pain.
This one says, I am a said victim, and I was asked by the senior pastor through another, I'm not sure exactly, to leave the church. And you are absolutely right. The pain is still fresh after 2 years. My question is, should I hold my breath? If not, may I ask you to convince me with your words?
Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry. That shouldn't happen. Going back to the church and trying to get justice is a good thing to do if you have it in you to do it. But it's okay to walk away to survive. And I know people who have walked away because they can't go back. And so you don't feel that it's your burden to save that church. But if you can go back, if you find you can go back to demand justice, I think it's really important to find other survivors of abuse who've been through it, to be advocates for you, to walk with you. And I know there are people in this room whose job it is to support victims of abuse. With Mennonite Central Committee, Elsie Gertzen has done fabulous work here, and other people like Vange Thiessen. And you are not alone. But I encourage you to not blame yourself for what happened. If there's any fear of that, is that there's healing and hope, and it can come in a lot of different ways, and I pray that you will find it. Thank you for coming today.
Can you speak into when people ask or require victims to be accountable for their sexual involvement in victimizing relationships?
Right, it's just too inappropriate. It's inappropriate for them to ask you that. But it happens all the time. You should have said no. That was wrong. I guess people who say those things to victims have never been in a situation where they're very vulnerable. They've never been broken and hurt and gone to a person they trust and been violated and manipulated. Because if they had been, they would never question it.
And this one says, what advice do you give for he said, she said cases that police or courts don't touch and where the truth of what happened is difficult to assess?
Right. Well, that's the whole Me Too movement, right? Whole Me Too movement. If enough people come forward, eventually justice happens. But, there are costs. And that's one of my fears about the Me Too movement, is that it just seems so simple. Just tell your story. Tell your story. There are huge repercussions when people tell their story. I was incredibly surprised to see Harvey Weinstein in handcuffs going to court, because I thought he was going to sue those women and their lives would be ruined, because he's a very powerful person. I wasn't sure he would go and be taken to justice. I know a woman who came forward to accuse a professor of misconduct. She did it on Twitter because she didn't want to go to the police, but she just said it on Twitter. She's being sued for libel right now. She has had to get a lawyer. She's 23. It's hard to tell your story, and there are ramifications for it. I don't want to pretend it's easy, but there are people who can help you figure it out. There are advocates who can help you. That website about the Mennonite Abuse Prevention List, that's their specialty. It's helping people tell their story without liability and helping you judge the liability. So I encourage you to get help for that.
This question says, speak to how you affirm and validate victims' stories without passing judgment on the accused prematurely.
Oh, that's a really good question. Because I hear that a lot. Is that how can we believe victims? How can we believe victims when maybe they're lying? Maybe they're just making that up. And there's a real fear about made-up stories. There's a real fear about that. Made-up stories are a very, very small percentage of stories. The majority of made-up stories about sexual misconduct come from abusers towards the people that they have abused. They say, they did this to me. They came and did that to me. That's statistically the most likely cause of false allegations. False allegations are in around 5% of stories. I think it's important to always value investigations. That the church doesn't say, here's a story, you're fired. It doesn't happen that way. There's always an investigation by their peers, usually, by outside agencies. They have the right to defend themselves, and they have a right of appeal. And so that's all going to happen in church settings, and David's going to probably talk about that.
If forgiveness can't be offered on behalf of someone else, can institutions confess on behalf of others? If so, how is this best done?
Right. An institution is an interesting thing because it's like a body itself, the church. So if a church 25 years ago did not listen to a story about abuse of a child, and the child grows up, they can't say, well, it was the church board, it was those 6 people that hurt me. They will always say, that church hurt me, because it's like a person. And so I think the people who are still a part of the church have an obligation to say that, this organization that has continued over time, we've done this. And they can speak on behalf of the organization. But it's tricky. I mean, you have to be careful. You don't know what was in the mind of people beforehand. The question is, do you hold people beforehand to account? I don't see that very often happening. In the Catholic Church, it is happening, where priests who covered for priests who abused are being now brought to court. And I haven't seen that happening in the Mennonite Church yet, but it's something to think about for the future, because if you as a church board let someone go and they then go on to abuse other people, what is your liability that you've done that? I think that in the future you may be held responsible because you didn't do something.
Do you think that churches that do not allow women to hold certain positions of leadership are inherently more prone to professional sexual misconduct? In other words, does the church enable professional sexual misconduct by giving men more power than women?
Well, I think patriarchy, the idea that men should hold power and women should be subservient, or complementarity, that women are given certain roles and men are given certain roles, set up the church in a certain way that makes it hard for victims to come forward. So in the Mennonite Brethren Church, in many places, if you are a woman victim, for you to go forward to your church is going to be difficult if all the people in leadership are men, because you will have to tell your story to a group of men. And it's not as likely for you to do that. I think if there is a female pastor, they're more likely to disclose their story to a female pastor. That's been my experience. I do not think that having men in leadership makes abuse happen more, because I think abuse happens in every church. Can happen in every church. Women can also abuse, but in my experience, I haven't ever met a woman who has pastorally abused anybody. I know it happens, but women pastors are more likely to be the target of sexual harassment than to be offenders themselves. I think it has to do with power dynamics in the church still and society.
Okay, this will be the last one. An elderly woman in my church shared that she was abused in the church 60 years ago. There may be 2 or 3 more elderly ladies who were victims back then, but they don't want to talk about it. The abuser has passed away long ago. Is there anything I need to do now about this?
How painful. How painful. I think that a church that prays for victims of abuse can help those women. I think a church that holds people to account now for current situations of abuse can also comfort women who have been hurt in the past. And I think just even showing that church leadership is open to hearing stories might open a window that they will talk to maybe just one person about it. The fact that they talked to this person is a good sign. Maybe they hadn't talked to anybody else. But a church that is being careful and loving for victims of abuse comforts not just those victims of abuse, but the other victims in the congregation that haven't told their story yet. Thanks.
Let's thank Carol once more. And thank to all of you who participated sending in your questions. There'll be more opportunity tomorrow through panel conversations as well as some more plenary discussions to have some interactions. And hopefully this sparks conversation just amongst the people that you are sitting around, whether it's later tonight or tomorrow. And so thank you for this first round of conversation.
Yes, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Again, if you're feeling triggered or frantic in any way, there is a quiet space in the bottom of this building where you can just take some time and process, or there are counselors there if you need somebody to talk to. And we welcome you all back tomorrow for an 8:30 morning start. And let us end this evening with these words. We offer our hearts and our tears as the hurt of victims of sexual misconduct echoes within us. O God, give us ears to hear the knocking of our neighbors.
We offer our outrage. Turn it into passion for justice. We offer all our skills. Use our gifts to end sexual exploitation. O God, help us see the hurt amongst us.
We position ourselves tonight alongside the victims of sexual harassment and aggression. We stand with them against the darkness. Let us not forget the reality of Good Friday. O God, we acknowledge the reality of darkness tonight.
That concludes this evening. We'll see you tomorrow.